4 stories, sitting in one chapter, with no obvious connection between any of them. A group of young men who fall asleep in a cave and wake up centuries later. A rich man with 2 vineyards who loses everything overnight. A prophet who follows a stranger and cannot stop asking questions. And a king who travels to the ends of the earth and builds a wall out of iron. They are separated by centuries, set in different lands, and populated by completely different kinds of people. Read them one after another, and they feel like 4 separate things that happen to end up in the same place. They are not 4 separate things. There is a single thread running through all 4, and it is deliberate, and it is the reason this chapter has been recited every Friday by Muslims for 1400 years. The thread has a name. It is not an abstract idea, and it is not a theme. It is a person, and he has not arrived yet. I am going to hold that back until the end, because the 4 stories only work if you meet them the way the chapter presents them, which is one at a time, apparently unrelated, with a pattern assembling underneath you while you read. By the last one, you will see it before I say it. The chapter is Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter of the Quran, and its name means the cave. It runs to 110 verses. It is Meccan, revealed during the period when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the small community around him were under sustained pressure in a city that had turned on them, and it is not a collection. That distinction matters enormously, and it is the first thing most readers miss. There is a tendency to treat chapters of the Quran as anthologies, containers holding assorted material that arrived at similar times. Some chapters do behave that way. This one does not. Al-Kahf is one of the most tightly organized units in the entire book, and the organization is visible on the surface once you know to look for it. Look at the architecture. 4 narratives, evenly distributed, each one self-contained, each one introduced with a similar formula, and between them, short passages of commentary that do not belong to any of the stories. Those interruptions are not filler. They are the chapter talking about the stories it is telling. And the whole structure is announced before the first story begins. Verse 7. Indeed, we have made that which is on the earth an adornment for it, that we may test which of them is best indeed. That is the thesis statement, and it is sitting in the 7th verse, before a single narrative starts. The chapter tells you at the outset that what follows is about testing. Everything on the earth has been made attractive on purpose, and the purpose is to find out how people behave. So 4 stories arrive, and the chapter has already told you they are examinations. Now, the question is, what is being examined? And this is where I want to be careful with you, because there is a difference between what the chapter says and what scholars have observed about it, and blurring that line is how bad content gets made. The chapter does not contain a verse listing 4 categories of trial. There is no line that says, here are the 4 things that test a human being. What exists is a reading, developed and taught by scholars across the tradition, which observes that the 4 narratives fall into 4 distinct areas, and that the areas cover the field almost completely. That reading is an interpretation, a very strong one, held widely and supported by the internal structure of the chapter. But it is a reading, and I would rather tell you that now than let you walk away thinking the Quran enumerated something it did not enumerate. Here is what that reading identifies. The first story is a trial of faith. The second is a trial of wealth. The third is a trial of knowledge. The fourth is a trial of power. Faith, wealth, knowledge, power. Sit with that list for a second and try to think of a serious temptation in a human life that falls outside it. What you believe, what you own, what you know, and what you can do to other people. That is most of the territory. And here is the part that turns a tidy observation into something worth 30 minutes of your attention. In each of the 4 stories, the chapter does not simply describe the trial. It embeds a response. A specific, quotable, portable response to that particular category of test, placed inside the narrative, easy to miss on a fast read. 4 trials, 4 answers, and 1 figure, mentioned nowhere in the chapter by name, who arrives at the end of time carrying all 4 at once. We start in the cave. A group of young men, in a city that has become hostile to what they believe, make a decision that costs them everything they have. The Quran does not date them, and does not name the city. It tells you they were youths who believed in their Lord, that God increased them in guidance, and that they stood up and said openly that their Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and that they would never call upon any god besides him. Then they left, not as an escape and not as a strategy. They withdrew to a cave because remaining meant abandoning what they believed, and they were not willing to do that. The verse records their reasoning, that having separated from their people and what those people worshipped, they should take refuge in the cave and let their Lord spread his mercy over them and arrange their affair in ease. That is the entire plan. Go into a hole in a mountain and trust. And God put them to sleep. The chapter says they remained there 300 years, and adds 9. And the tradition reads the additional 9 as the difference between counting in solar years and counting in lunar ones. 300 solar years is 309 lunar years, the same span expressed twice. And while they slept, the chapter describes the scene around them in a way that has no narrative function whatsoever. It tells you the sun, when it rose, would move away from their cave to the right, and when it set, would pass them by on the left, while they lay in a wide space within it. It tells you they were turned over, to the right and to the left, and it tells you their dog was stretched out with its forelegs at the entrance. None of that advances the plot. A dog lying at a cave mouth with its front legs extended is not a detail a storyteller includes for effect. It is the kind of thing you mention because it was there. That dog, incidentally, has occupied more commentary than most of the human characters in the chapter, and the reason is what happens a few verses later. The chapter turns and addresses a dispute. It reports that people will say the sleepers were 3, the 4th of them their dog. That others will say 5, the 6th of them their dog, guessing at the unseen. That others will say 7, and the 8th of them their dog, and then it delivers the instruction. Say, my Lord is most knowing of their number. None knows them except a few. So, do not argue about them except with an obvious argument, and do not inquire about them from anyone. Read what just happened there. In the middle of telling the story, the chapter stops, lists 3 competing head counts, declines to settle which is correct, and instructs the reader not to argue about it and not to go asking around. The number of sleepers is the single most obvious question a reader has. The chapter refuses it on purpose and tells you the refusal is deliberate. And then, immediately after, comes an instruction that arrived in this exact context and became a permanent feature of Muslim speech. Do not say of anything, I will surely do that tomorrow, except when adding, if God wills. They woke with no idea. One of them was sent into the city with old currency to buy food, and the currency is what gave them away. The city he walked into had changed completely. The regime that had persecuted them was gone. The belief they had been driven out for holding was now the belief of the city. Think about the shape of that. They gave up their homes, their families, their futures, and their entire social standing for a conviction, with no evidence that it would ever be vindicated, and no expectation of living to see it. And then they woke into a world where the thing they had sacrificed for had won. That is the trial of faith, and notice the specific form it takes. It is not doubt about whether God exists. Not one of these young men expresses uncertainty. The trial is whether you can hold a belief when holding it makes you an outcast, when the culture around you treats it as absurd, and when there is no visible reward coming. The trial is not believing. The trial is standing alone. And notice how little they were given. No miracle was performed for them before they entered the cave. No sign was shown to convince them. No guarantee was offered about how it would end. They made a decision on the strength of a conviction, and then they walked into the dark with a dog and nothing else. Every part of the vindication happened while they were unconscious. They did not fight the regime that persecuted them, and they did not live to watch it fall. The entire reversal took place in a gap they had no awareness of and no participation in. That is a very particular message for a community under pressure in Mecca in the year this chapter was revealed. It is also a very particular message for anyone holding an unpopular conviction now. The vindication, if it comes, may not come in a form you get to witness, and may not require anything further from you than remaining. And here is the response the chapter embeds. And this is why the placement matters so much. Shortly after this story, in verse 28, comes an instruction that is not addressed to the sleepers at all. It is addressed to the prophet, peace be upon him, directly. Keep yourself patient with those who call upon their Lord in the morning and the evening, seeking his countenance, and do not let your eyes pass beyond them. desiring the adornment of worldly life. Read that against the story that just ended. The young men in the cave survived by being together. There is no single sleeper in this account. They went in as a group, they slept as a group, they woke as a group, and the entire time the chapter refers to them in the plural. Their preservation is a collective preservation. And immediately afterward the text turns and says, "Stay with the people who are calling on their Lord, and do not look past them at people who have more." The answer to the trial of faith is company. Not argument, not proof, not a stronger case. Who you stand next to. That is the first thread, and it is a practical instruction rather than a spiritual sentiment. If your belief is under pressure, the variable that determines the outcome is not the quality of your reasoning. It is whether you are alone. Second story. A man owns 2 gardens. The description in the chapter is specific and almost agricultural. 2 vineyards bordered with date palms, with crops between them, and a river flowing through the middle. Both gardens produced their yield without failing in anything. He had abundance, and he had it reliably, which is rarer and more corrupting than sudden wealth. He had a companion, and the 2 of them talk, and the conversation is the entire point of the story. The wealthy man says he has more wealth, and is mightier in men. Then he walks into his garden and says something that the chapter records with what can only be described as precision. He says he does not think this will ever perish. And he says he does not think the hour will occur. And then he adds that even if he were returned to his Lord, he would surely find something better than this there. Follow the sequence, because it is a diagnosis rather than a description. It starts with permanence, the assumption that this will not end. Then it moves to denial, the conclusion that no reckoning is coming at all. And then the most revealing line of the 3, the assumption that if there is a reckoning, he will do well in it, because the fact that he has been given all of this must mean something about how he stands. That is the trial of wealth in its exact clinical form. It is not greed, and it is not enjoyment. It is the belief that what you have is evidence of who you are. His companion answers him, and the answer contains the response the chapter is teaching. And notice who is delivering it. The companion is described in the chapter as having less. He is the poorer man in the conversation, and he has just been told to his face that the other one has more wealth and more men behind him. He does not dispute the inventory. He never claims the gardens are not real or not impressive. What he disputes is the conclusion drawn from them. He asks him a question first, whether he disbelieves in the one who created him from dust, and then a sperm drop, and then proportioned him into a man. And then he says the line that has become a fixed phrase in Muslim life. Why, when you entered your garden, did you not say, "What God has willed, there is no power except with God"? Masha Allah, la quwwata illa billah. That sentence is the answer to the second trial, and look at what it actually does. It does not require giving up the garden. Nobody in this story is told to become poor. It requires attaching the garden to its source, saying that what you have arrived through a will that is not yours, and that whatever capacity you have to hold on to it is also not yours. Then the gardens were destroyed. The chapter says their fruit was encompassed by ruin, and he began turning his hands over in regret at what he had spent, while the vines lay collapsed on their supports. And he said, "If only I had not associated anyone with my Lord." He learned the sentence. He learned it one day too late. And the chapter adds a detail in the wreckage that is easy to skim past. It says he had no group to help him, none at all, apart from God. Go back to the boast. He had said he was mightier in men. His confidence was not only in the vineyards, it was in the people he could call on. When the gardens went, the men went with them, because they had never been his in the first place. They had been the wealth's. Then the chapter delivers the summary line for the whole episode. There, authority belongs to God, the true. He is best in reward and best in outcome. And immediately afterward it supplies an image that has become one of the most quoted passages in the Quran on the nature of worldly things. It compares the life of this world to water sent down from the sky, which mixes with the vegetation of the earth so that everything flourishes and then becomes dry stubble scattered by the winds. Notice the time scale in that comparison. The whole cycle is one season, not a long decline, green and then gone, in the space of a single growing year. And then the verse that names the 2 things being weighed. Wealth and children are the adornment of the life of this world, but the enduring good deeds are better with your Lord for reward and better for hope. That verse contains the same word the chapter used in verse 7, when it announced that everything on the earth had been made an adornment in order to test people. The word comes back here, attached specifically to wealth. The frame the chapter set up at the start is being closed around the second story. Quick word before we continue. If this is landing for you, take a second to subscribe and hit that like button. It genuinely moves this channel forward more than you would think. And I want your answer in the comments on this one, because we are halfway through the 4, and the question is worth asking honestly. Of these 4 trials, faith, wealth, knowledge, and power, which one do you think is hardest to survive today? Not in the 7th century. Now, in the world you actually live in. Tell me which, and tell me why. I read them all. Then stay with me, because the 3rd story is the strangest passage in the entire Quran, and it is the one where a prophet gets something wrong. Which brings us to the 3rd trial. This one begins with a question that was answered badly. The setup is not in the chapter itself. It is in Sahih al-Bukhari, and it explains why the episode happened. Musa was asked who the most knowledgeable person on earth was, and he answered that it was himself. It was not an unreasonable answer. He was the prophet of his age. He had spoken with God directly, and he had been given the scripture of his people. He was corrected. He was told there was a servant at the junction of the 2 seas who knew something he did not. And the whole episode that follows exists because a prophet gave a confident answer about the extent of his own knowledge. The Quran picks it up from there. Musa tells his companion that he will not give up until he reaches the junction of the 2 seas, even if he has to travel for ages. They lose a fish at the meeting point, and the loss of the fish is the sign, and they turn back and find him. The Quran does not name this man. It calls him a servant from among our servants, to whom we had given mercy from us and taught knowledge from us. The name Al-Khidr comes from the hadith literature rather than from the chapter, and the question of whether he was a prophet or a righteous servant is a genuine point of scholarly disagreement that has never been settled, which is worth saying rather than smoothing over. Musa asks permission to follow him so that he might be taught, and the answer he gets is a warning. You will never be able to have patience with me. How can you have patience with something you do not encompass in knowledge? And Musa says the line that is the answer to this entire trial. You will find me, if God wills, patient, and I will not disobey you in any order. Then 3 things happen, and Musa fails all 3. They board a ship, and the man puts a hole in the hull. Musa objects. He is reminded of the warning and apologizes. They meet a boy, and the man kills him. Musa objects far more strongly this time, and calls it a terrible thing. He is reminded again. They come to a town that refuses to feed them, and inside that town is a wall on the verge of collapse, and the man repairs it without asking for payment. Musa objects to this one too, and points out that he could at least have taken a wage, and that 3rd objection ends the arrangement. Then the explanations arrive, and every one of them inverts the appearance. The ship belonged to poor men working at sea, and there was a king ahead seizing every seaworthy vessel by force. The damage saved it. The boy's parents were believers, and the child would have overwhelmed them with transgression and disbelief, and a replacement was intended who would be better. The wall belonged to 2 orphaned boys in the town, and beneath it was a treasure that belonged to them, and their father had been righteous, and the repair was so that they would reach maturity and recover it themselves. 3 acts that looked like vandalism, murder, and pointless charity. 3 purposes, none of which were visible from where Musa was standing. This is the trial of knowledge, and notice its exact form. Musa is not ignorant. He is a prophet, and everything he objects to on correct moral grounds. Damaging a poor man's boat is wrong. Killing a child is wrong. Working without pay when you are hungry is a bad arrangement. His reasoning is sound at every step. The trial is not stupidity. The trial is the assumption that what you can see is the whole picture. That is a much harder test than it sounds, and it is the one that becomes more dangerous the more you actually know. A person with no knowledge does not presume. A person with real expertise, who has been right many times, develops a reasonable confidence in their own reading of a situation, and that confidence is exactly what fails here. And the answer the chapter embeds is contained in a single clause of Musa's promise. If God wills, patient. He said it, and then he could not do it, which is itself the lesson. The response to the trial of knowledge is not to become more knowledgeable. It is to hold your conclusions loosely and to admit in advance that your capacity is contingent. The man himself makes the point at the end. He tells Musa that he did none of it of his own accord. Even the one who had the hidden knowledge was not the source of it. And there is one more detail in the arrangement that is easy to walk past. Musa is the greater of the two figures in every conventional sense. He is a messenger. He received scripture. He confronted Pharaoh, and the Quran returns to his story more than any other. He is also the one asking to be taught. The chapter puts the more important man in the position of student, and then has him fail. Not because he was arrogant in any obvious way, but because knowing a great deal is not the same as knowing everything, and the gap between those two is exactly where a person gets caught. One story left. Dhul-Qarnayn is introduced as someone God established in the earth and gave means to everything, power, and the resources to exercise it. He then does something that only makes sense if you understand the point being made, which is that he uses it 3 times in 3 different situations and behaves the same way in all 3. He travels west until he reaches the setting of the sun and finds a people there, and he is given a choice explicitly in the text: either punish them or adopt among them a way of goodness. That is absolute authority, stated plainly. Do whatever you want with these people. He answers that whoever does wrong will be punished and then return to his Lord for a greater punishment. But whoever believes and does righteousness will have the best reward, and he will speak to him from his command with ease. He chooses justice over both cruelty and indulgence, and he does it while explicitly acknowledging a higher authority than his own. He travels east and finds a people with no shelter from the sun, and the chapter simply notes it and moves on. Then the third journey, and the famous one. He reaches a place between 2 mountain barriers and finds a people who could barely understand speech. They tell him that Ya'juj and Ma'juj are causing corruption in the land, and they offer him payment to build a barrier. Watch his answer, because this is the response the chapter is teaching. He refuses the money. He says that what his Lord has established him in is better, and asks only for their labor. Then he has them bring blocks of iron until the gap between the 2 mountainsides is level, and he has them blow on it until it is like fire, and pours molten copper over it. And the barrier is high enough and smooth enough that Ya'juj and Ma'juj could neither scale it nor bore through it. He built something no one else could build, using resources no one else had, and refused to be paid for it. And consider who he refused. These were not powerful people. They are described as barely able to understand speech, and they were being terrorized. They had no leverage over him at all. He could have named any price and they would have paid it, and nobody in the story would have been in a position to object. Absolute power over people who cannot resist you is the most complete version of the 4th trial there is. He was handed it twice, once in the West and once here, and both times he did the same thing with it. And then he says the line that closes the 4th trial: "This is a mercy from my Lord. But when the promise of my Lord comes, he will make it level. And the promise of my Lord is true." Look at what he does in that one breath. He credits the achievement to God rather than to himself. And then he predicts its destruction at the top of his own success, in the moment of his greatest engineering accomplishment. That is the trial of power, and the answer to it is not weakness. Nobody in this story gives up authority. Dhul-Qarnayn remains a king with the means to do anything. The answer is knowing the source of the authority and knowing that it has an expiry date. Now we can name the thread. 4 stories: faith, wealth, knowledge, power, and in each one, a specific response placed inside the narrative. Against the trial of faith, stay with the people who are calling on their Lord, and do not look past them at people who have more. Against the trial of wealth, say what God has willed. There is no power except with God. Against the trial of knowledge, say if God wills, and admit that your capacity is not your own. Against the trial of power, say this is a mercy from my Lord, and remember that it ends. 4 different answers, and every one of them does the same thing. Every one of them attaches the thing being tested to God rather than to the self. That is the thread. Now the figure who has not been named. There is a narration in Sahih Muslim, recorded as Hadith 809, from Abu al-Darda, may Allah be pleased with him, Whoever memorizes 10 verses from the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf will be protected from the Dajjal. That is the connection, and it is stated in one of the two most rigorously authenticated collections in Sunni Islam. Muslim himself preserves a variation inside the same collection. One transmitter gives it as 10 verses from the beginning, another as from the end. The collectors kept both readings rather than choosing, which is the pattern of preservation you would expect from people transmitting rather than composing. And I want to be precise about a second narration, because it is the one everybody actually acts on, and it does not carry the same grade. The report about reciting this chapter on Friday, and a light shining between the two Fridays, is not in Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. It comes through al-Hakim, al-Bayhaqi, and al-Darimi, and its strongest form is a statement of the companion Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, rather than a direct statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Al-Hakim graded its chain sound. Ibn Hajar called it the strongest report narrated regarding this chapter. Al-Albani graded it authentic. Ibn Qudamah and Al-Nawawi both held that reciting it on Friday is recommended. So, the Friday practice is a genuine recommended sunnah, established by scholars across the tradition. It simply rests on a different tier of evidence than the 10 verses do, and you should know which is which. Now, why the Dajjal specifically? Al-Nawawi gave the reason directly. The beginning of this chapter contains wonders and signs, and whoever reflects on them will not be deceived by the trial of the Dajjal. Go and look at what the hadith literature says the Dajjal actually arrives with. He comes with what appear to be miracles, commanding the sky and having it rain, commanding the earth and having it produce. The treasures of the earth follow him. He makes claims about himself that no created being can make, and he is given dominion, moving across the earth with authority over those who follow him. Faith, wealth, knowledge, power. He is not four separate temptations. He is all four of them arriving at once, in one person, at the end of time. And this chapter, revealed centuries earlier, spends 110 verses running a person through each of the four individually, and hands them a response to each one. It is training. That is why it is weekly. A test you can only take once is a test you fail once. A pattern you rehearse every 7 days becomes something you recognize when you see it. And here is the part that matters most, because almost nobody watching this will meet the Dajjal. You will meet the four. Every single one of you already has. A belief that costs you something socially. A comfort that starts to feel like proof of your own worth. A situation where you are completely certain and completely wrong. A moment where you had authority over somebody and had to decide how to use it. The chapter is not primarily about the end of time. The end of time is the extreme case. The four trials are the ordinary week. And that reframes what the four responses are for. Saying that a thing came from God rather than from you is not a phrase you deploy in an emergency. It is a habit, and habits are built in conditions where nothing much is at stake. The man with the gardens did not fail on the day they were destroyed. He failed across all the ordinary afternoons before that, when the vines were producing and there was no reason to think about where any of it came from. And the last thing worth saying is the same thing this channel keeps arriving at, because the Quran keeps arriving at it. Chapter 39, verse 53. Say, O my servants, who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of God. Indeed, God forgives all sins. Indeed, He is the forgiving, the merciful. The man with the 2 gardens learned his sentence too late, and the chapter records his regret without a word of contempt for him. It gives him the line anyway. It gives it to you before your gardens are gone. 4 stories, no obvious connection, 1 chapter. And if you want the 4th one in full, the whole account of Dhul-Qarnayn, the wall, and what the Quran actually says about Yajuj and Majuj, that video is on this channel, and it is the natural next one to watch.